Okay. Now, oops. I gotta figure out a better way to do this. And all right, there we go. Welcome to chapter 2. This will be how many pages? Come on. Where's chapter 3? There it is. Okay. To page 87. Similar thickness to previous chapter. Okay. Chapter 2. Integration. In the morning, In the morning, I woke with my senses heightened, so that even the rough brown bark of the pines or the ordinary lunging swoop of a woodpecker came to me as a kind of minor revelation. The lingering fatigue from the four-day hike to base camp had left me. Was this some side effect of the spores, or just the result of a good night's sleep? I felt so refreshed that I didn't really care. But my reverie was soon tempered by disastrous news. The anthropologist was gone, her tent empty of her personal effects. Worse, in my view, the psychologist seemed shaken, and as if she hadn't slept. She was squinting oddly, her hair more wind-blown than usual. I noticed dirt caked on the sides of her boots. She was favoring her right side, as if she had been injured. "Where's the anthropologist?" the surveyor demanded, while I hung back, trying to make my own sense of it. "What have you done with the anthropologist?" was my unspoken question, which I knew was unfair. The psychologist was no different than she had been before, and I knew the secret to her magician's show did not necessarily mean she was a threat. The psychologist stepped into our rising panic with a strange assertion. I talked to her late last night. What she saw in that structure unnerved her to the point that she did not want to continue with this expedition. She started back to the border to await extraction. She took a partial report with her so that our superiors will know our progress. The psychologist's habit of allowing a slim smile to cross her face at inappropriate times made me want to slap her. "But she left her gear, her gun too," the surveyor said. "She took only what she needed, so we would have more, including an extra gun." "Do you think we need an extra gun?" I asked the psychologist. I was truly curious. In some ways, I found the psychologist as fascinating as the tower. Her motivations, her reasons. Why not resort to hypnosis now? Perhaps, even with our underlying conditioning, some things are not suggestible, or fade with repetition, or she lacked the stamina for it after the events of the night before. "I think we don't know what we need," the psychologist said, but we definitely did not need the anthropologist here if she was unable to do her job. The surveyor and I stared at the psychologist. The surveyor's arms were crossed. We had been trained to keep a close watch on our colleagues for sign of sudden mental stress or dysfunction. She was probably thinking what I was thinking. We had a choice now. We could accept the psychologist's explanation for the anthropologist's disappearance or reject it. If we rejected it, then we were saying the psychologist had lied to us, and therefore also rejecting her authority at a critical time. And if we tried to follow the trail back home, hoping to catch up with the anthropologist, to verify the psychologist's story, would we have the will to return to base camp afterward? We should continue with our plan, the psychologist said. We should investigate the tower. The word tower in this context felt like a blatant plea for my loyalty. Still the surveyor wavered, as if fighting the psychologist's suggestion from the night before. This alarmed me in another way. I was not going to leave Area X before investigating the tower. This fact was ingrained in every part of me, and in that context I could not bear to think of losing another member of the team so soon, leaving me alone with the psychologist. Not when I was unsure of her, and not when I still had no idea of the effects of my exposure to the spores. She's right, I said. We should continue with the mission. We can make do without the anthropologist. But my pointed stare to the surveyor made it clear to both of them that we would revisit the issue of the anthropologist later. The surveyor gave a surly nod and looked away. An audible sigh of either relief or exhaustion came from the psychologist. That's settled then, she said, and brushed past the surveyor to start making breakfast. The anthropologist had always made breakfast before. At the tower, the situation changed yet again. The surveyor and I had readied light packs with enough food and water to spend the full day down there. We both had our weapons. We both had donned our breathing masks to keep out the spores, even though it was too late for me. We both wore hard hats with fixed beams on them. But the psychologist stood on the grass just beyond the circle of the tower, slightly below us, and said, "I'll stand guard here." "Against what?" I asked, incredulous. I did not want to let the psychologist out of my sight. I wanted her embedded in the risk of the exploration, not standing at the top with all the power over us implied by that position. The surveyor wasn't happy either. In an almost pleading way that suggested a high level of suppressed stress, she said, "You're supposed to come with us. It's safer with 3. "But you need to know that the entrance is secured," the psychologist said, sliding a magazine into her handgun. The harsh scraping sound echoed more than I would have thought. The surveyor's grip on her assault rifle tightened until I could see her knuckles whiten. "You need to come down with us." "There's no reward in the risk of us all going down," the psychologist said, and from the inflection I recognized a hypnotic command. The surveyor's grip on her rifle loosened. The features of her face became somehow indistinct for a moment. "You're right," the surveyor said. "Of course you're right. It makes perfect sense." A twinge of fear traveled down my back. Now it was 2 against 1. I thought about that for a moment, took in the full measure of the psychologist's stare as she focused her attention on me. Nightmarish, paranoid scenarios came to me, returning to find the entrance blocked or the psychologist picking us off as we reached for the open sky. Except she could have killed us in her sleep any night of the week. "It's not that important," I said after a moment. "You're as valuable to us here as down there." And so we descended, as before, under the psychologist's watchful eye. The first thing I noticed on the staging level before we reached the wider staircase that spiraled down, before we encountered again the words written on the wall, the tower was breathing. The tower breathed, and the walls, when I went to touch them, carried the echo of a heartbeat, and they were not made of stone but of living tissue. Those walls were still blank, but a kind of silvery white phosphorescence rose off of them. The world seemed to lurch, and I sat down heavily next to the wall, and the surveyor was by my side, trying to help me up. I think I was shaking as I finally stood. I don't know if I can convey the enormity of that moment in words. The tower was a living creature of some sort. We were descending into an organism. "What's wrong?" the surveyor was asking me, voice muffled through her mask. "What happened?" I grabbed her hand, forced her palm against the wall. "Let me go!" She tried to pull away, but I kept her there. "Do you feel that?" I said, unrelenting. "Can you feel that?" "Feel what? What are you talking about?" She was scared, of course. To her, I was acting irrationally. Still, I persisted. A vibration, a kind of beat. I removed my hand from hers, stepped back. The surveyor took a long, deep breath and kept her hand on the wall. No, maybe. No, nothing. What about the wall? What is it made of? Stone, of course, she said. In the arc of my helmet flashlight, her shadowed face was hollowed out, her eyes large and encircled by darkness, the mask making it look like she had no nose or mouth. I took a deep breath. I wanted it to all spill out, that I had been contaminated, the psychologist was hypnotizing us far more than we might have suspected, that the walls were made of living tissue. But I didn't. Instead, I got my... the swear word. I got my stuff together, as my husband used to say. I got myself together because we're going forward and the surveyor couldn't see what I saw, couldn't experience what I was experiencing, and I couldn't make her see it. Forget it, I said. I became disoriented for a second. Look, we should go back up now. You're panicking, the surveyor said. We had all been told we might see things that weren't there while in Area X. I know she was thinking that this had happened to me. I held up the black box on my belt. Nope, it's not flashing. We're good. It was a joke, a feeble joke, but still. You saw something that wasn't there. She wasn't going to let me off the hook. You can't see what is there, I thought. Maybe, I admitted, but isn't that important too? Isn't that part of all this, the reporting? And something I see that you don't might be important. The surveyor weighed that for a moment. How do you feel now? I feel fine, I lied. I don't see anything now, I lied. My heart felt like an animal had become trapped in my chest and was trying to crawl out. The surveyor was now surrounded by a corona of the white phosphorescence from the walls. Nothing was receding, nothing was leaving me. Then we'll go on, the surveyor said, but only if you promise to tell me if you see anything unusual again. I almost laughed at that, I remember. Unusual? Like strange words on a wall, written among tiny communities of creatures of unknown origin? I promise, I said. And you will do the same for me, right? Turning the tables, making her realize it might just happen to her, too. She said, just don't touch me again or I'll hurt you. I nodded in agreement. She didn't like knowing I was physically stronger than her. Under the terms of that flawed agreement, we proceeded to the stairs and into the gullet of the tower, the depths now revealing themselves in a kind of ongoing horror show of such beauty and biodiversity that I could not fully take it all in. But I tried, just as I had always tried, even from the very beginning of my career. My lodestone, the place I always thought of when people asked me why I became a biologist, was the overgrown swimming pool in the backyard of the rented house where I grew up. My mother was an overwrought artist who achieved some success but was a little too fond of alcohol and always struggled to find new clients, while my dad, the underemployed accountant, specialized in schemes to get rich quick that usually brought in nothing. Neither of them seemed to possess the ability to focus on one thing for any length of time. Sometimes it felt as if I had been placed with a family rather than born into one. They did not have the will or inclination to clean the kidney-shaped pool, even though it was fairly small. Soon after we moved in, the grass around its edges grew long, sedge weeds and other towering plants became prevalent. The short bushes lining the fence around the pool lunged up to obscure the chain link. Moss grew in the cracks in the tile path that circled it. The water level slowly rose, fed by the rain, and the surface became more and more brackish with algae. Dragonflies continually scouted the area. Bullfrogs moved in, the wiggling, malformed dots of their tadpoles always present. Water gliders and aquatic beetles began to make the place their own. Rather than get rid of my 30-gallon freshwater aquarium, as my parents wanted, I dumped the fish into the pool, and some survived the shock of that. Local birds like herons and egrets began to appear, drawn by the frogs and fish and insects. By some miracle, too, small turtles began to live in the pool, although I had no idea how they had gotten there. Within months of our arrival, the pool had become a functioning ecosystem. I would slowly enter through the creaking wood gate and observe it all from a rusty lawn chair I had set up in a far corner. Despite a strong and well-founded fear of drowning, I had always loved being around bodies of water. Inside the house, my parents did whatever banal, messy thing people in the human world usually did, some of it loudly, but I could easily lose myself in the micro-world of the pool. Inevitably, my focus netted from my parents' useless lectures of worry over my chronic introversion, as if by doing so they could convince me they were still in charge. I didn't have enough, or any, friends, they reminded me. I didn't seem to make the effort. I could be earning money from a part-time job, but when I told them that several times, like a reluctant antlion, I had to hide from bullies at the bottom of the gravel pits that lay among the abandoned fields beyond the school, they had no answers. Nor when one day, for no reason, I punched a fellow student in the face when she said hello to me in the lunch line. So we proceeded, locked into our separate imperatives. They had their lives and I had mine. I liked most of all pretending to be a biologist, and pretending often leads to becoming a reasonable facsimile of what you mimic, even if only from a distance. I wrote down my pool observations in several journals. I knew each individual frog from the next. Old Flopper was so much different from Ugly Leaper, and during which month I could expect the grass to teem with hopping juveniles. I knew which species of heron turned up year-round and which were migrants. The beetles and the dragonflies were harder to identify, their life cycles harder to intuit, but I still diligently tried to understand them. In all of this, I eschewed books on ecology or biology. I wanted to discover the information on my own first. As far as I was concerned, an only child and an expert in the uses of solitude, my observations of this miniature paradise could have continued forever. I even jury-rigged a waterproof light to a waterproof camera and planned to submerge the contraption beneath the dark surface, to snap pictures using a long wire attached to the camera button. I have no idea if it would have worked, because suddenly I didn't have the luxury of time. Our luck ran out, and we couldn't afford the rent anymore. We moved to a tiny apartment stuffed full of my mother's paintings, which all resembled wallpaper to me. One of the great traumas of my life was worrying about the pool. Would the new owners see the beauty and the importance of leaving it as it is, or would they destroy it, create unthinking slaughter in honor of the pool's real function? I never found out. I couldn't bear to go back, even if I also could never forget the richness of that place. All I could do was look forward, apply what I had learned from watching the inhabitants of the pool. And I never did look back, for better or worse. If funding for a project ran out, or the area we studied was suddenly bought for development, I never returned. There are certain kinds of deaths that one should not be expected to relive, certain kinds of connections so deep that when they are broken, you feel the snap of the link inside you. Good line. As we descended into the tower, I felt again, for the first time in a long time, the flush of discovery I had experienced as a child, but I also kept waiting for the snap. Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner? I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead to share with the worms that... The tower steps kept repeating themselves, those whitish steps like the spiraling teeth of some unfathomable beast, and we kept descending because there seemed to be no choice. I wished at times for the blinkered seeing of the surveyor. I knew now why the psychologist had sheltered us, and I wondered how she withstood it, for she had no one else to shield her from anything. At first there were merely the words, and that was enough. They occurred always at roughly the same level against the left-hand side of the wall, and for a time I tried to record them, but there were too many of them, and the sense of them came and went, so that to follow the meaning of the words was to follow a trail of deception. That was one agreement the surveyor and I came to right away. that we would document the physicality of the words, but that it would require a separate mission, another day, to photograph that continuous, never-ending sentence. To share with the worms that gather in the darkness and surround the world with the power of their lives, while from the dim-lit halls of other places, forms that never could be writhed for the impatience of the few who had never seen or been seen. The sense of unease in ignoring the ominous quality of those words was palpable. It infected our own sentences when we spoke, as we tried to catalog the biological reality of what we were both seeing. Either the psychologist wanted us to see the words and how they were written, or simply suppressing the physical reality of the tower's walls was a monumental and exhausting task. These things, too, we experienced together during our initial descent into the darkness. The air became cooler, but also damp, and with the drop in temperature came a kind of gentle sweetness, as of a muted nectar. We also both saw the tiny hand-shaped creatures that lived among the words. The ceilings were higher than we would have guessed, and by the light of our helmets as we looked up, the surveyor could see glints and whorls as of the trails of snakes or slugs. Little tufts of moss or lichen dotted that ceiling, and exhibiting a great tensile strength, tiny long-limbed translucent creatures that resembled cave shrimp stilt-walked there as well. Things only I could see, that the walls minutely rose and fell with the tower's breathing, that the colors of the words shifted in a rippling effect, like the strobing of a squid. That, with a variation of about 3 inches above the current words and 3 inches below, there existed a ghosting of prior words written in the same cursive script. Effectively, these layers of words formed a watermark, for they were just an impression against the wall, a pale hint of green or sometimes purple, the only sign that once they might have been raised letters. Most seemed to repeat the main thread, but some did not. For a time, while the surveyor took photographic samples of the living words, I read the phantom words to see how they might deviate. It was hard to read them. There were several overlapping strands that started and started up again. I easily lost track of individual words and phrases. The number of such ghost scripts faded into the wall suggested this process had been ongoing for a long time. Although without some sense of length of each cycle, I could not even give a rough estimate in years. There was another element to the communications on the wall, too, one I wasn't sure if the surveyor could see or not. I decided to test her. "Do you recognize this?" I asked the surveyor, pointing to a kind of interlocking latticework that at first I hadn't even realized was a pattern, but that covered the wall from just below the phantom scripts to just above them. The main strand, roughly in the middle, it vaguely resembled scorpions strung end to end arising, only to be subsumed again. I didn't even know if I was looking at a language, per se. It could have been a decorative pattern for all I knew. Much to my relief, she could see it. "No, I don't recognize it," she said, "but I'm not an expert." I felt a surge of irritation, but it wasn't directed at her. I had the wrong brain for this task, and so did she. We needed a linguist. We could look at that latticework script for ages, and the most original thought I would have is that it resembled the shape of a branching of hard coral. To the surveyor it might resemble the rough tributaries of a vast river. Eventually, though, I was able to reconstruct fragments of a handful of some of the variants. Why should I rest when wickedness exists in the world? God's love shines on anyone who understands the limits of endurance and allows forgiveness, chosen for the service of a higher power. If the main thread formed a kind of dark, incomprehensible sermon, then the fragments shared an affinity with that purpose, without the heightened syntax. Did they come from longer accounts of some sort, possibly from members of prior expeditions? If so, for what purpose, and over how many years? But all such questions would be for later, in the light of the surface. Mechanically, like a golem, I just took photographs of key phrases, even as the surveyor thought I was clicking pictures of a blank wall or off-center shots of the main fungal words, to put some distance between myself and whatever I might think about these variants. While the main scrawl continued and continued to unnerve. In the black water with the sun shining at midnight, those fruit shall come ripe, and in the darkness of that which is golden shall split open to reveal the revelation of the fatal softness in the earth. Those words defeated me somehow. I took samples as we went, but half-heartedly. All of these tiny remnants I was stuffing into glass tubes with tweezers, what would they tell me? Not much, I felt. Sometimes you get a sense of when the truth of things will not be revealed by microscopes. Soon, too, the sound of the heartbeat through the walls became so loud to me I stopped to put in earplugs to muffle its beat, choosing a moment while the surveyor's attention lay elsewhere. Bemasked, half-deaf for different reasons, we continued our descent. It should have been me who noticed the change, not her. But after an hour of downward progress, the surveyor stopped on the steps below me. Do you think the words on the wall are becoming fresher? Fresher? More recent. I just stared at her for a moment. I had become acclimated to the situation, had done my best to pretend to be the kind of impartial observer who simply catalogues details. But I felt all of that hard-won distance slipping away. "Turn off your light?" I suggested, as I did the same. The surveyor hesitated. After my show of impulsiveness earlier, it would be some time before she trusted me again. Not the kind of trust that responded unthinkingly to a request to plunge us into darkness, but she did it. The truth was, I had purposefully left my gun in its belt holster, and she could have extinguished me in a moment with her assault rifle, with one fluid motion pulling on the strap and freeing it from her shoulder. This premonition of violence made little rational sense, and yet it came to me too easily, almost as if placed in my mind by outside forces. In the dark, as the tower's heartbeat still throbbed against my eardrums, the letters, the words, swayed as the walls trembled with their breathing, and I saw that indeed the words seemed more active, the colors brighter, the strobing more intense than I remembered it from the levels above. It was an even more noticeable effect than if the words had been written in ink with a fountain pen, the bright, wet slickness of the new. Standing there in that impossible place, I said it before the surveyor could, to own it. Something below us is writing this script. Something below us may still be in the process of writing this script. We were exploring an organism that might contain a mysterious second organism, which was itself useful, using yet other organisms to write words on the wall. It made the overgrown pool of my youth seem simplistic, one-dimensional. We turned our lights back on. I saw fear in the surveyor's eyes, but also a strange determination. I have no idea what she saw in me. "Why did you say something?" she asked. I didn't understand. "Why did you say something rather than someone? Why can't it be someone?" I just shrugged. "Get out your gun," the surveyor said, a hint of disgust in her voice making some deeper emotion. I did as I was told, because it didn't really matter to me, but holding the gun made me feel clumsy and odd, as if it were the wrong reaction to what might confront us. Whereas I had taken the lead to this point, now it seemed as if we had switched roles, and the nature of our exploration changed as a result. Apparently we had just established a new protocol. We stopped documenting the words and organisms on the wall. We walked much more swiftly, our attention focused on interpreting the darkness in front of us. We spoke in whispers, as if we might be overheard. I went first, with the surveyor covering me from behind until the curves where she went first, and I followed. At no point did we speak of turning back. The psychologist watching over us might as well have been thousands of miles away. We were charged with the nervous energy of knowing there might be some answer below us, a living, breathing answer. At least, the surveyor may have thought of it in those terms. She couldn't feel or hear the beating of the walls, but as we progressed, even I could not see the writer of those words in my mind. All I could see was what I'd seen when I'd stared back at the border on our way to base camp, a fuzzy white blankness. Yet still I knew it could not be human. Why? For a very good reason, one the surveyor finally noticed another 20 minutes into our descent. "There's something on the floor," she said. Yes, there was something on the floor. For a long time now, the steps had been covered in a kind of residue. I hadn't stopped to examine it because I hadn't wanted to unnerve the surveyor, uncertain if she would ever come to see it. The residue covered a distance from the edge of the left wall to about 2 feet from the right wall. This meant it filled a space on the steps about 8 or 9 feet wide. "Let me take a look," I said, ignoring her quivering finger. I knelt, turning to train my helmet light on the upper steps behind me. The surveyor walked up to stare over my shoulder. The residue sparkled with a kind of subdued golden shimmer shot through with flakes of red like dried blood. It seemed particularly reflective. I probed it with a pen. "It's slightly viscous, like slime," I said, "and about half an inch deep over the steps." The overall impression was of something sliding down the stairs. "What about those marks?" the surveyor asked, leaning forward to point again. She was whispering, which seemed useless to me, and her voice had a catch in it. But every time I noticed her becoming more panicky, I found it made me calmer. I studied the marks for a moment, sliding perhaps, or dragged, but slowly enough to reveal much more in the residue left behind. The marks she had pointed to were oval and about 1 foot long by half a foot wide. 6 of them were splayed over the steps in 2 rows. A flurry of indentations inside these shapes resembled the marks left by cilia. About 10 inches of these outside of these tracks, encircling them, were 2 lines. This irregular double circle undulated out and then in again, almost like the hem of a skirt. Beyond this hem were faint indicators of further waves, as if some force emanating from a central body had left a mark. It resembled most closely to the lines left in sand as the surf recedes during low tide, except that something had blurred the lines and made them fuzzy, like charcoal drawings. This discovery fascinated me. I could not stop staring at the trail, the cilia marks. I imagined such a creature might correct for the slant of the stairs, much like a geostabilizing camera would correct for bumps in a track. "Have you ever seen anything like that?" the surveyor asked. "No," I replied. With an effort, I bit back a more caustic response. "No, I never have." Certain trilobites, snails, and worms left trails simple by comparison, but vaguely similar. I was confident no one back in the world had ever seen a trail this complex or large. "What about that?" The surveyor indicated a step a little farther up. I trained the light on it and saw a suggestion of a boot print in the residue. Just one of our own boots. So mundane in comparison, so boring. The light on her helmet shuddered from side to side as she shook her head. "No, see." She pointed out my boot prints and hers. This imprint was from a 3rd set and headed back up the steps. "You're right," I said. "That's another person down here, not long ago." The surveyor started cursing. At the time, we didn't think to look for more sets of boot prints. According to the records we'd been shown, the first expedition reported nothing unusual in Area X, just pristine, empty wilderness. After the 2nd and 3rd expeditions did not return, and their fate became known, the expeditions were shut down for a time. When they began again, it was usually using carefully chosen volunteers who might at least know a measure of the full risk. Since then, some expeditions had been more successful than others. The 11th expedition in particular had been difficult, and personally difficult for me with regard to a fact of which I have not been entirely honest thus far. My husband was on the 11th expedition as a medic. He had never wanted to be a doctor, had always wanted to be the first response or working in trauma. A triage nurse in the field, as he put it. He had been recruited for Area X by a friend who remembered him from when they had both worked for the Navy before he switched over to ambulance service. At first, he hadn't said yes, had been unsure, but over time they convinced him. It caused a lot of strife between us. I know this information might not be hard for anyone to find out, but I have hoped that in reading this account you might find me a credible, objective witness. Not someone who volunteered for Area X because of some other event unconnected to the purpose of the expeditions. And in a sense, this is still true, and my husband's status as a member of an expedition is, in many ways, irrelevant to why I signed up. But how could I not be affected by Area X if only through him? One night, about a year after he had headed for the border, as I lay alone in bed, I heard someone in the kitchen. Armed with a baseball bat, I left the bedroom and turned on all the lights in the house. I found my husband next to the refrigerator, still dressed in his expedition clothes, drinking milk until it flowed down his chin and neck, eating leftovers furiously. I was speechless. I could only stare at him as if he were a mirage, and if I moved on or said anything, he would dissipate into nothing, or less than nothing. We sat in the living room, him on the sofa and me in a chair opposite. I needed some distance from this sudden apparition. He did not remember how he had left Area X, did not remember the journey home at all. He had only the vaguest recollection of the expedition itself. There was an odd calm about him, punctured only by moments of remote panic when, in asking him what had happened, he recognized that his amnesia was unnatural. Gone from him, too, seemed to be any memory of how our marriage had begun, to disintegrate as well as before our arguments over his leaving for Area X. He contained within him now the very distance he had in so many subtle and not-so-subtle ways accused me of in the past. After a time, I couldn't take it any longer. I took off his clothes, made him shower, and led him into the bedroom, and made love to him with me on top. I was trying to reclaim remnants of the man I remembered, the one who, so unlike me, was outgoing and impetuous, and always wanted to be of use. The man who had been a passionate recreational sailor, and for 2 weeks out of the year went with friends to the coast to go boating. I could find none of that in him now. The whole time he was with me, he looked up at my face with an expression that told me he did remember me, but only through a kind of fog. It helped for a while, though. It made him feel more real, allowed me to pretend. But only for a while. I only had him in my life again for about 24 hours. They came for him the next evening, and once I went through the long, drawn-out process of receiving security clearance, I visited him in the observation facility right up until the end. That antiseptic place where they tested him and tried without success to break through both his calm and his amnesia. He would greet me like an old friend, an anchor of sorts, to make sense of his existence, but not like a lover. I confess I went because I had hopes that there remained some spark of the man I'd once known, but I never really found it. Even the day I was told he had been diagnosed with inoperable systemic cancer, my husband stared at me with a slightly puzzled expression on his face. He died 6 months later. During all that time, I could never get beyond the mask, could never find the man I had known inside of him. Not through my personal interactions with him, not through eventually watching the interviews with him and the other members of the expedition, all of whom died of cancer as well. Whatever had happened in Area X, he had not come back. Not really. Ever farther down into the darkness we went, and I had to ask myself if any of this had been experienced by my husband. I did not know how my infection changed things. Was I on the same journey, or had he found something completely different? If similar, how had his reactions been different, and how had that changed what happened next? The path of slime grew thicker, and we could now tell that the red flecks were living organisms discharged by whatever lay below, for they wriggled in the viscous layer. The color of the substance had intensified, so that it resembled a sparkling golden carpet set out for us to tread upon on our way to some strange yet magnificent banquet. Should we go back? The surveyor would say, or I would say. And the other would say, just around the next corner, just a little farther, and then we'll go back. It was a test of a fragile trust. It was a test of our curiosity and fascination, which walked side by side with our fear. A test of whether we preferred to be ignorant or unsafe. The feel of our boots as we advanced step by careful step through that viscous discharge, the way in which the stickiness seemed to mire us even as we managed to keep moving, would eventually end in inertia, we knew, if we pushed too far. But then the surveyor rounded a corner ahead of me and recoiled into me, shoved me back up the steps, and I let her. "There's something down there," she whispered in my ear. "Something like a body or a person." I couldn't point out that a body could be a person. Is it writing words on the wall? No, slumped down by the side of the wall. I only caught a glimpse. Her breathing came quick and shallow against her mask. "A man or a woman?" I asked. "I thought it was a person," she said, ignoring my question. "I thought it was a person. I thought it was." Bodies were one thing. No amount of training could prepare you for encountering a monster. But we could not climb back out of the tower without first investigating this new mystery. We could not. I grabbed her by the shoulders, made her look at me. "You said it's like a person sitting down against the side of the wall. That's not whatever we've been tracking. This has to do with the other boot print. You know that. We can't risk taking a look at whatever this is, and then we will go back up. We can risk taking a look at whatever this is, and then we will go back up. This is as far as we go, no matter what we find. I promise." The surveyor nodded. The idea of this being the extent of it, of not going farther down, was enough to steady her. "Just get through this last thing, and you'll see the sunlight soon." We started back down. The steps seemed particularly slippery now, even though it might have been our jitters, and we walked slowly, using the blank slate of the right wall to keep our balance. The tower was silent, holding its breath, its heartbeat suddenly slow and far more distant than before. Or perhaps I could only hear the blood rushing through my head. Turning the corner, I saw the figure and shone my helmet light on it. If I'd hesitated a second longer, I never would have had the nerve. It was the body of the anthropologist, slumped against the left-hand wall, her hands in her lap, her head down as if in prayer, something green spilling out from her mouth. Her clothing seemed oddly fuzzy, indistinct. A faint golden glow arose from her body, almost imperceptible. I imagined the surveyor could not see it at all. In no scenario could I imagine the anthropologist alive. All I could think was, the psychologist lied to us. And suddenly the pressure of her presence far above, guarding the entrance, was pressing down on me in an intolerable way. I pulled out a palm to the surveyor, indicating that she should stay where she was behind me, and I stepped forward, light pointed down into the darkness. I walked past the body, far enough to confirm the stairs below were empty, then hurried back up. "Keep watch while I take a look at the body," I said. I didn't tell her I had sensed a faint echoing suggestion of something much farther below, moving slowly. "It is a body," the surveyor said. Perhaps she had expected something far stranger. Perhaps she thought the figure was just sleeping. "It's the anthropologist," I said, and saw that information register in the tensing of her shoulders. Without another word, she brushed past me to take up a position just beyond the body, assault rifle aimed into the darkness. Gently, I knelt beside the anthropologist. There wasn't much left of her face, and odd burn marks were all over the remaining skin, spilling out from her broken jaw, which looked as though someone had wrenched it open in a single act of brutality, was a torrent of green ash that sat on her chest in a mound. Her hands, palms up in her lap, had no skin left on them, only a kind of gauzy filament and more burn marks. Her legs seemed fused together and half melted, one boot missing and one flung against the wall. Strewn around the anthropologist were some of the same sample tubes I had brought with me. Her black box, crushed, lay several feet from her body. "What happened to her?" the surveyor whispered. She kept taking quick, nervous glances back at me as she stood guard, almost as if whatever had happened wasn't over, as if she expected the anthropologist to come back to horrifying life. I didn't answer her. All I could have said was, "I don't know," a sentence that was becoming a kind of witness to our own ignorance or incompetence, or both. I shone my light on the wall above the anthropologist. For several feet, the script on the wall became erratic, leaping up and dipping down before regaining its equilibrium. The shadows of the abyss are like the petals of a monstrous flower that shall blossom within the skull and expand the mind beyond what any man can bear. "I think she interrupted the creator of the script on the wall," I said. "And it did that to her?" She was pleading with me to find some other explanation. I didn't have one, so I didn't reply, just went back to observing as I stood there, watching me. A biologist is not a detective, but I began to think like a detective. I surveyed the ground to all sides, identifying first my own boot prints on the steps, and then the surveyor's. We had obscured the original tracks, but you could still see traces. First of all, the thing, and no matter what the surveyor might hope, I could not think of it as human, had clearly turned in a frenzy. Instead of the smooth sliding tracks, the slime residue formed a kind of clockwise swirl, and marks of the feet, as I thought of them, elongated and narrowed by the sudden change. But on top of this swirl I could also see boot prints. I retrieved the one boot, being careful to walk around the edges of the evidence of the encounter. The boot prints in the middle of the swirl were indeed from the anthropologist, and I could follow partial imprints back up the right-hand side of the wall, as if she had been hugging it. An image began to form in my mind of the anthropologist creeping down in the dark to observe the creature of the script. The glittering glass tubes strewn around her body made me think that she had hoped to take a sample. But how insane or oblivious. Such a risk, and the anthropologist had never struck me as impulsive or brave. I stood there for a moment, and then backtracked even farther up the stairs as I motioned to the surveyor, much to her distress, to hold her position. Perhaps, if there had been something to shoot, she would have been calmer, but we were left with only what lingered in our imaginations. Another dozen steps up, right where you still could have a slit of a view of the dead anthropologist, I found two sets of boot prints facing each other. One set belonged to the anthropologist, the other was neither mine nor the surveyor's. Something clicked into place, and I could see it all in my head. In the middle of the night, the psychologist had woken the anthropologist, put her under hypnosis, and together they had come to the tower and climbed down this far. At this point, the psychologist had given the anthropologist an order under hypnosis, one that she probably knew was suicidal, and the anthropologist had walked right up to the thing that was writing the words on the wall and tried to take a sample, and died trying, probably in agony. The psychologist had then fled. Certainly, as I walked back down, I could find no trace of her boot prints below that point. Was it pity or empathy that I felt for the anthropologist, weak, trapped, with no choice? The surveyor waited for me, anxious. "What did you find?" "Another person was here with the anthropologist," I told the surveyor my theory. "But why would the psychologist do that?" she asked me. "We were going to all come down here in the morning anyway." I felt as if I were observing the surveyor from 1,000 miles away. "I have no idea," I said, But she has been hypnotizing all of us, and not just to give us peace of mind. Perhaps this expedition had a different purpose than what we were told. Hypnotism, she said the word like it was meaningless. How do you know that? How could you possibly know that? The surveyor seemed resentful of me or of the theory. I couldn't tell which, but I could understand why. Because somehow I've become impervious to it, I told her. She hypnotized you before we came down here today to make sure you would do your duty. I saw her do it. I wanted to confess to the surveyor, to tell her how I had become impervious, but believed that it would be a mistake. And you did nothing? If this is even true? At least she was considering the possibility of believing me. Perhaps some residue, some fuzziness from the episode had stuck in her mind. I didn't want the psychologist to know that she couldn't hypnotize me, and I had wanted to come down here. The surveyor stood there for a moment, considering. Believe me or don't believe me, I said, but believe this. When we go up there, we need to be ready for anything. We may need to restrain or kill the psychologist because we don't know what she's planning. Why would she be planning anything, the surveyor asked. Was that disdain in her voice or just fear again? Because she might have different orders than the ones we got, I said, as if explaining to a child. When she did not reply, I took that as a sign that she was beginning to acclimate to the idea. I'll need to go first, because she can't affect me, and you'll need to wear these. It might help you resist the hypnotic suggestion. I gave her my extra set of earplugs. She took them hesitantly. No, she said. We'll go up together at the same time. That isn't wise, I said. I don't care what it is. You're not going up top without me. I'm not waiting there in the dark for you to fix everything. I thought about that for a moment, then said, fine. But if I see that she is starting to coerce you, I'll have to stop her, or at least try. If you're right, the surveyor said, if you're telling the truth. I am. She ignored me, said, what about the body? Did that mean we agreed? I hoped so. Or maybe she would try to disarm me on the way up. Perhaps the psychologist had already prepared her in this regard. We leave the anthropologist here. We can't be weighed down, and we also don't know what contaminants we might bring with us. The surveyor nodded. At least she wasn't sentimental. There was nothing left of the anthropologist in that body, and we both knew it. I was trying very hard not to think of the anthropologist's last moments alive, of the terror she must have felt as she continued trying to perform a task that she had been willed to do by another, even though it meant her own death. What had she seen? What had she been looking at before it all went dark? Before we turned back, I took one of the glass tubes strewn around the anthropologist. It contained just a trace of a thick, flesh-like substance that gleamed darkly golden. Perhaps she had gotten a useful sample after all, near the end. After we ascended toward the light, I tried to distract myself. I kept reviewing my training over and over again, searching for a clue, for any scrap of information that might lead to some revelation about our discoveries. But I could find nothing. Could only wonder at my own gullibility in thinking that I had been told anything at all of use. Always the emphasis was on our own capabilities and knowledge base. Always, as I looked back, I could see that there had been an almost willful intent to obscure, to misdirect, disguised as concern that we not be frightened or overwhelmed. The map had been the first form of misdirection. For what was a map but a way of emphasizing some things and making other things invisible? Always we were directed to the map, to memorizing the details on the map. Our instructor, who remained nameless to us, drilled us for 6 long months on the position of the lighthouse relative to the base camp, the number of miles from one ruined patch of houses to another, the number of miles of coastline we would be expected to explore, almost always in the context of the lighthouse, not the base camp. We became so comfortable with the map, with the dimensions of it, and the thought of what it contained that it stopped us from asking why or even what. Why this stretch of coast? What might lie inside the lighthouse? Why was the camp set back into the forest, far from the lighthouse, but fairly close to the tower, which of course did not exist on the map? And had the base camp always been there? What lay beyond the map? Now that I knew the extent of the hypnotic suggestion that had been used on us, I realized that the focus on the map might have itself been an embedded cue. That if we did not ask questions, it was because we were programmed not to ask questions. That the lighthouse, representative or actual, might have been a subconscious trigger or a hypnotic suggestion, and that it might have also been the epicenter of whatever had spread out to become Area X. My briefing on the ecology of that place had had a similar blinkered focus. I had spent most of my time becoming familiar with the natural transitional ecosystems with the flora and fauna and the cross-pollination I could expect to find. But I'd also had an intense refresher on fungi and lichen that, in light of the words on the wall, now stood out in my mind as being the true purpose of all of that study. If the map had been solely to distract, then the ecology research had meant, after all, to truly prepare me. Unless I was being paranoid. But if I wasn't, it meant they knew about the tower, perhaps, had always known about the tower. From there, my suspicions grew. They had put us through grueling survival and weapons training, so grueling that most evenings we went right to sleep in our separate quarters. Even on those few occasions when we trained together, we were training apart. They took away our names in the second month, stripped them from us. The only names applied to things in Area X and only in terms of their most general label. This, too, a kind of distraction from asking certain questions that could only be reached through knowing specific details. But the right specific details, not, for example, that there were 6 species of venomous snakes in Area X. A reach, yes, but I was not in the mood to set aside even the most unlikely scenarios. By the time we were ready to cross the border, we knew everything, and we knew nothing. The psychologist wasn't there when we emerged, blinking into the sunlight, ripping off our masks and breathing in the fresh air. We had been ready for almost any scenario, but not for the psychologist's absence. It left us adrift for a while, afloat in that ordinary day, the sky so brightfully blue, the stand of trees casting long shadows. I took out my earplugs and found I couldn't hear the beating of the tower's heartbeat at all. How what we had seen below could coexist with the mundane was so baffling. It was as if we had come up too fast from a deep-sea dive. But it was the memories of the creatures we had seen that had given us the bends. We just kept searching the environs for the psychologist, certain that she was hiding and half hoping we would find her, because surely she had an explanation. It was, after a time, pathological to keep searching the same area around the tower, but for almost an hour we could not find a way to stop. Finally, I could not deny the truth. "She's gone," I said. "Maybe she's back at the base camp," the surveyor said. "Would you agree that her absence is a sign of guilt?" I asked. The surveyor spat into the grass, regarded me closely. "No, I would not. Maybe something happened to her. Maybe she needed to go back to the camp. You saw the footprints. You saw the body." She motioned with her rifle. Let's just get back to base camp." I couldn't read her at all. I didn't know if she was turning on me or just cautious. Coming up above ground had emboldened her, regardless, and I had preferred her uncertain. But back at the base camp, some of her resolve crumbled again. The psychologist wasn't there. Not only wasn't she there, but she'd taken half of our supplies and most of the guns. Either that or buried them somewhere, so we knew the psychologist was alive. You must understand how I felt then, how the surveyor must have felt. We were scientists, trained to observe natural phenomena and the results of human activity. We had not been trained to encounter what appeared to be the uncanny. The unusual situations, there can be a comfort in the presence of even someone you think might be your enemy. Now we had come close to the edges of something unprecedented. And less than a week into our mission, we had lost not just the linguist at the border, but our anthropologist and our psychologist. Okay, I give up, the surveyor said, throwing down her rifle and sagging into a chair in front of the anthropologist's tent as I rummaged around inside of it. I'm going to believe you for now. I'm going to believe you because I don't really have a choice, because I don't have any better theories. What should we do now? There still weren't any clues in the anthropologist's tent. The horror of what had happened to her was still hitting me, to be coerced into your own death. If I was right, the psychologist was a murderer, much more so than whatever had killed the anthropologist. When I didn't answer the surveyor, she repeated herself with extra emphasis. So what the hell are we going to do now? Emerging from the tent, I said, we examine the samples I took. We develop the photographs and go through them. Then tomorrow, we probably go back down into the tower. The surveyor gave a harsh laugh as she struggled to find words. Her face seemed to almost want to pull apart for a second, perhaps from the strain of fighting off the ghost of some hypnotic suggestion. Finally, she got it out. No, I'm not going back to that place, and it's a tunnel, not a tower. What do you want to do instead? I asked. As if she'd broken through some barrier, the words now came faster, more determined. We go back to the border and await extraction. We don't have the resources to continue, and if you're right, the psychologist is out there right now plotting something, even if it's just what excuses to give us. And if she's not, if she's dead or injured because something attacked her, that's another reason to get the hell out. She'd lit a cigarette, one of the few we'd been given. She blew 2 long plumes of smoke out of her nose. I'm not ready to go back, I told her. Not yet. I wasn't near ready, despite what had happened. You prefer this place. You really do, don't you? The surveyor said. It wasn't really a question. A kind of pity or disgust infused her voice. You think this is going to last much longer? Let me tell you, even on military maneuvers designed to simulate negative outcomes, I've seen better odds. Fear was driving her, even if she was right. I decided to steal my delaying tactics from the psychologist. Let's just look at what we brought back, and then we can decide what to do. You can always head back to the border tomorrow. She took another drag on the cigarette, digesting that. The border was still a 4-day hike away. True enough, she said, relenting for the moment. I didn't say what I was thinking, that it might not be that simple, that she might make it back across the border only in the abstract sense that my husband had, stripped of what made her unique. But I didn't want her to feel as if she had no way out. I spent the rest of the afternoon looking at samples under the microscope on the makeshift table outside of my tent. The surveyor busied herself with developing the photographs in the tent that doubled as a darkroom, a frustrating process for anyone used to digital uploads. Then, while the photos were resting, she went back through the remnants of maps and documents the prior expedition had left at the base camp. My samples told a series of cryptic jokes with punchlines I didn't understand. The cells of the biomass that made up the words on the wall had an unusual structure, but they still fell within an acceptable range. Or those cells were doing a magnificent job of mimicking certain species of saprotrophic organisms. I made a mental note to take a sample of the wall from behind the words. I had no idea how deeply the filaments had taken root, or if there were nodes beneath and those filaments were only sentinels. The tissue sample from the hand-shaped creature resisted any interpretation, and that was strange, but told me nothing. By which I mean I found no cells in the sample, just a solid amber surface with air bubbles in it. At the time, I interpreted this as a contaminated sample or evidence that this organism decomposed quickly. Another thought came to me too late to test, that, having absorbed the organism's spores, I was causing a reaction in the sample. I didn't have the medical facilities to run the kind of diagnostics that might have revealed any future changes to my body or mind since the encounter. Then there was the sample from the anthropologist's vial. I'd left it for last for obvious reasons. I had the surveyor take a section, put it on the slide, and write down what she saw through the microscope. Why? She asked. Why do you need me to do this? I hesitated. Hypothetically, there could be contamination. Such a hard face, jaw tight. Hypothetically, why would you be any more or less contaminated than me? I shrugged. No particular reason. I was the first one to find the words on the wall, though. She looked at me as if I'd spouted nonsense, laughed harshly. We're in so much deeper than that. Do you really think those masks we wore are going to keep us safe from whatever's going on here? She was wrong. I thought she was wrong, but I didn't correct her. People trivialize or simplify data for so many reasons. There was nothing else to be said. She went back to her work as I squinted through the microscope at the sample from whatever had killed the anthropologist. At first I didn't know what I was looking at because it was so unexpected. It was brain tissue, and not just any brain tissue. The cells were remarkably human, with some irregularities. My thought at the time was that the sample had been corrupted, but if so, not by my presence. The surveyor's notes perfectly described what I saw, and when she looked at the sample again later, she confirmed its unchanging nature. I kept squinting through the microscope lens and raising my head and squinting again, as if I couldn't see the sample correctly. Then I settled down and stared at it until it became just a series of squiggles and circles. Was it really human? Was it pretending to be human? As I said, there were irregularities, and how had the anthropologist taken the sample? Just walking up to the thing with an ice cream scoop and asked, "Can I take a biopsy of your brain?" No, the sample had come from the margins, from the exterior, which meant it couldn't be brain tissue, which meant it was definitely not human. I felt unmoored, drifting once again. About then, the surveyor strode over and threw the developed photographs down on my table. "Useless," she said. Every photograph of the words on the wall was a riot of luminous, out-of-focus color. Every photograph of anything other than the words had come out as pure darkness. The few in-between photos were also out of focus. I knew this was probably because of the slow, steady breathing of the walls, which might also have been giving off some kind of heat or other agent of distortion. A thought that made me realize I had not taken a sample of the walls. I had recognized the words were organisms. I had known the walls were too, but my brain had still registered walls as inert, part of a structure. Why sample them? "I know," the surveyor said, misunderstanding my cursing. "Any luck with the samples?" No luck at all," I said, still staring at the photographs. "Anything in the maps and papers?" The surveyor snorted. "Not a damn thing, nothing. Except they all seemed fixated on the lighthouse, watching the lighthouse, going to the lighthouse, living in the lighthouse. So we have nothing." The surveyor ignored that and said, "What do we do now?" It was clear she hated asking the question. "Eat dinner," I said. "Take a little stroll around the perimeter to make sure the psychologist isn't hiding in the bushes. Think about what we're doing tomorrow. I'll tell you one thing we're not doing tomorrow. We're not going back into the tunnel." "Tower." She glared at me. There was no point in arguing with her. At dusk, the familiar moaning came to us from across the salt marsh flats as we ate our dinner around the campfire. I hardly noticed it, intent on my meal. The food tasted so good, and I didn't know why. I gobbled it up, had seconds while the surveyor baffled, just staring at me. We had little or nothing to say to each other. Talking would have meant planning, and nothing I wanted to plan would please her. The wind picked up, and it began to rain. I saw each drop fall as a perfect faceted liquid diamond, refracting light even in the gloom, and I could smell the sea and picture the roiling waves. The wind was like something alive. It entered every pore of me, and it, too, had a smell, carrying with it the earthiness of the marsh reeds. I had tried to ignore the change in the confirmed space of the tower, but my senses still seemed too acute, too sharp. I was adapting to it, but at times like this I remembered that just a day ago I had been someone else. We took turns standing watch. Loss of sleep seemed less foolhardy than letting the psychologist sneak up on us unannounced. She knew the location of every perimeter tripwire, and we had no time to disarm and reset them. I let the surveyor take the first watch as a gesture of good faith. In the middle of the night, the surveyor came in to wake me up for the second shift, but I was already awake because of the thunder. Grumpily, she head off to bed. I doubt she trusted me. I just think she couldn't keep her eyes open a moment longer after the stresses of the day. The rain renewed its intensity. I didn't worry that we'd be blown away. These tents were Army regulation and could withstand anything short of a hurricane. But if I was going to be awake anyway, I wanted to experience the storm. So I walked outside into the welter of the stinging water, the gusting pockets of wind. I already could hear the surveyor snoring in her tent. She probably had slept through much worse. The dull emergency lights glowed from the edges of the camp, making the tents into triangles of shadow. Even the darkness seemed more alive to me, surrounding me like something physical. I can't even say it was a sinister presence. I felt in that moment as if it were all a dream. The training, my former life, the world I'd left behind, none of that mattered anymore. Only this place mattered. Only this moment, and not because of the psychologist had hypnotized me. In the grip of that powerful emotion, I stared out toward the coast, through the jagged, narrow spaces between the trees. There, a greater darkness gathered, the confluence of the night and the clouds and the sea. Somewhere beyond, another border. Then, through that darkness, I saw it, a flicker of orange light, just a touch of illumination, too far up in the sky. This puzzled me until I realized it must originate with the lighthouse. As I watched, the flicker moved to the left and up slightly before being snuffed out, then reappeared a few minutes later, much higher, then was snuffed out for good. I waited for the light to return, but it never did. For some reason, the longer the light stayed out, the more restless I became, as if in this strange place a light, any sort of light, was a sign of civilization. Almost there. There had been a storm that final full day alone with my husband after he returned from the 11th expedition. A day that had the clarity of a dream, of something strange yet familiar routine but strange calmness, even more than I had become accustomed to before he left. In those last weeks before the expedition, we had argued violently. I had shoved him up against a wall, thrown things at him, anything to break through the armor of resolve that I know might have been thrust upon him by hypnotic suggestion. If you go, I had told him, you might not come back, and you can't be sure I'll be waiting for you if you do, which had made him laugh infuriatingly and say, "Oh, have you been waiting for me all this time? Have I arrived yet?" He was set in his course by then, and any obstruction was a source of rough humor for him, and that would have been entirely natural, hypnosis or not. It was entirely in keeping with his personality to become set on something and follow it, regardless of the consequences. To let an impulse become a compulsion, especially if he thought he was contributing to a cause greater than himself. It was one reason he had stayed in the Navy for a second tour. Our relationship had been thready for a while, in part because he was gregarious and I preferred solitude. This had once been a source of strength in our relationship, but no longer. Not only had I found him handsome, but I admired his confident, outgoing nature, his need to be around people. I recognized this as a healthy counterbalance to my personality. He had a good sense of humor, too, and when we first met at a crowded local park, he snuck past my reticence by pretending we were both detectives working on a case, and we were there to watch a suspect, which led to making up facts about the lives of the busy hive of people buzzing around us, and then about each other. At first, I must have seemed mysterious to him, my guardedness, my need to be alone, even after he thought he'd gotten inside my defenses. Either I was a puzzle to be solved, or he just thought that once he got to know me better, he could still break through to some other place, some core where another person lived inside of me. During one of our fights, he admitted as such, tried to make his volunteering for the expedition a sign of how much I had pushed him away, before taking it back later, ashamed. I told him point blank so there would be no mistake. This person he wanted to know better did not exist. I was who I seemed to be from the outside. That would never change. Early in our relationship, I had told my husband about the swimming pool as we lay in bed, something we did a lot of back then. He had been captivated, possibly even thinking there were more interesting revelations to come. He had pushed aside the parts that spoke of an isolated childhood to focus entirely on the pool itself. I would have sailed boats on it. Captained by old Flopper, no doubt, I replied, and everything would have been happy and wonderful. No, because I would have found you surly and willful and grim, fairly grim. I would have found you frivolous and wished really hard for the turtles to scuttle your boat. If they did, I would have just rebuilt it even better and told everyone about the grim kid who talked to frogs. I had never talked to the frogs. I despised anthropomorphizing animals. So what has changed if we wouldn't have liked each other as kids? I asked. Oh, I would have liked you despite that, he said, grinning. You would have fascinated me, and I would have followed you anywhere, without hesitation. So we fit back then, in our odd way. We clicked by being opposites, and took pride in the idea that this made us strong. We reveled in this construct so much, for so long, that it was a wave that did not break until after we were married, and then it destroyed us over time, in depressing familiar ways. But none of this, the good or the bad, mattered when he returned from the expedition. I asked no questions, did not bring up any of our past arguments. I knew when I woke up beside him that morning after his return that our time together was already running out. I made him breakfast, while outside the rain beat down, lightning crackling nearby. We sat at the kitchen table, which had a view through the sliding glass doors of the backyard, and had an excruciatingly polite conversation over eggs and bacon. He admired the gray shape of the new bird feeder I had put in, and the water feature that now rippled with raindrops. I asked him if he had gotten enough sleep and how he felt. I even asked again questions from the night before, like whether the journey back had been tough. No, he said, effortless, flashing an imitation of his old infuriating smile. How long did it take? I asked. No time at all. I couldn't read his expression, but in its blankness, I sensed something mournful, something left inside that wanted to communicate but couldn't. My husband had never been mournful or melancholy as long as I had known him, and this frightened me a little. He asked me how my research was going, and I told him about some of the new developments. At the time, I worked for a company devoted to the creation of natural products that broke down plastics and other non-biodegradable substances. It was boring. Before that, I had been out in the field, taking advantage of various research grants. Before that, I had been a radical environmentalist, participating in protests and employed by a nonprofit to call donors on the phone. And your work? I asked, tentative, not sure how much more circling I could do, ready at a moment's notice to dart away from the mystery. Oh, you know, he said, as if he'd only been away a few weeks, as if I were a colleague, not his lover, his wife. Oh, you know, the same as always, nothing really new. He drank deeply from his orange juice, really drank to savor it, so that for a minute or two, nothing existed in the house but his enjoyment. Then he casually asked about other improvements around the house. After breakfast, we sat out on the porch watching the sheets of rain, the puddles collecting in the herb garden. We read for a while, then went back inside and made love. It was a kind of repetitive, trance-like love, comfortable only because the weather cocooned us. If I had been pretending up until that point, I couldn't fool myself any longer that my husband was entirely present. Then it was lunch, and then television. I found a rerun of a two-man sailing race for him, and more banal talk. He asked about some of his friends, and I had no answers. I never saw them. They'd never really been my friends. I didn't cultivate friends. I just inherited them from my husband. We tried to play a board game and laughed at some of the sillier questions. Then weird gaps in his knowledge became apparent and we stopped, a kind of silence settling over us. He read the paper and caught up on his favorite magazines, watched the news, or perhaps he only pretended to do those things. When the rain stopped, I woke up from a brief nap on the couch to find him gone from beside me. I tried not to panic when I checked every room and couldn't find him anywhere. I went outside and eventually found him around the side of the house. He was standing in front of the boat he had bought a few years back, which we could never fit in the garage. It was just a cruiser, about 20 feet long, but he loved it. As I came and curled my arm around his, he had a puzzled, almost forlorn look in his face, as if he could remember that the boat was important to him, but not why. He didn't acknowledge my presence, kept staring at the boat with a growing blank intensity. I could feel him trying to recall something important. I just didn't realize until much later that it had to do with me, that he could have told me something vital then, there, if he could only have recalled what. So we just stood there. And although I could feel the heat and weight of him beside me, the steady sound of his breathing, we were living apart. After a while, I couldn't take it. The sheer directionless anonymity of his distress, his silence. I led him back inside. He didn't stop me. He didn't protest. He didn't try to look back over his shoulder at the boat. I think that's when I made my decision. If he had only looked back, if he had just resisted me, even for a moment, it might have been different. At dinner, as he was finishing, they came for him in 4 or 5 unmarked cars and a surveillance van. They did not come in rough or shouting, with handcuffs and weapons on display. Instead, they approached him with respect. One might almost say fear, the kind of watchful gentleness you might display if about to handle an unexploded bomb. He went without protest, and I let them take this stranger from my house. I couldn't have stopped them, but I also didn't want to. The last few hours I had coexisted with him in a kind of rising panic, more and more convinced that whatever had happened to him in Area X had turned him into a shell, an automaton going through the motions, someone I had never known. With every atypical act or word, he was driving me further from the memory of the person I had known, and despite everything that had happened, preserving that idea of him was important. That is why I called the special number he had left for me for emergencies. I didn't know what to do with him, couldn't coexist with him any longer in this altered state. Seeing him leave, I felt mostly a sense of relief, to be honest, not guilt at betrayal. What else could I have done? As I have said, I visited him in the observation facility right up until the end. Even under hypnosis in those taped interviews, he had nothing new to say, really, unless it was kept from me. I remember mostly the repetitious sadness in his words. I'm walking forever on the path from the border to base camp. It is taking a long time, and I know it will take even longer to get back. There is no one with me. I am all by myself. The trees are not trees, the birds are not birds, and I am not me, but just something that has been walking for a very long time. This was really the only thing I discovered in him after his return. A deep and unending solitude, as if he had been granted a gift that he didn't know what to do with, a gift that was poison to him and eventually killed him. But would it have killed me? That was the question that crept into my mind even as I stared into his eyes those last few times, willing myself to know his thoughts and failing. As I labored at my increasingly repetitive job in a sterile lab, I kept thinking about Area X and how I would never know what it was like without going there. No one could really tell me, and no account could possibly be a substitute. So several months after my husband died, I volunteered for an Area X expedition. A spouse of a former expedition member had never signed up before. I think they accepted me in part because they wanted to see if that connection might make a difference. I think they accepted me as an experiment. But then again, maybe from the start, they expected me to sign up. By morning, it had stopped raining, and the sky was a searing blue, almost devoid of clouds. Only the pine needles strewn across the top of our tents and the dirty puddles and fallen tree limbs on the ground told of the storm the night before. The brightness infecting my senses had spread to my chest. I can describe it no other way. Internally, there was a brightness in me, a kind of prickling energy and anticipation that pushed hard against my lack of sleep. Was this part of the change? But even so, it didn't matter. I had no way to combat what might be happening to me. I also had a decision to make. Finding myself torn between the lighthouse and the tower. Some part of the brightness wanted to return to the darkness at once, and the logic of this related to nerve, or lack of it. To plunge right back into the tower without thought, without planning, would be an act of faith, of sheer resolve or recklessness, with nothing else behind it. But now I also knew that someone had been in the lighthouse the night before. If the psychologist had sought refuge there and I could track her down, then I might gain more insight into the tower before exploring it further. This seemed of increasing importance, more so than the night before, because the number of unknowns the tower represented had multiplied tenfold. So by the time I talked to the surveyor, I had decided on the lighthouse. The morning had the scent and feel of a fresh start, but it was not to be. If the surveyor had wanted no part of a return to the tower, then she equally had no interest in the lighthouse. "You don't want to find out if the psychologist is there?" The surveyor gave me a look, as if I had said something idiotic. Holed up in a high position with clear lines of sight in every direction, in a place they've told us has a weapons cache, I'll take my chances here. If you were smart, you'd do the same. You might find out that you don't like a bullet hole in the head. Besides, she might be somewhere else. Her stubbornness tore at me. I didn't want to split up for purely practical reasons. It was true we had been told prior expeditions had stored weapons at the lighthouse, and because I believed it more likely that the surveyor would try to go home without me there. "It's the lighthouse or the tower," I said, trying to sidestep the issue, "and it would be better for us if we found the psychologist before we went back down into the tower. She saw whatever killed the anthropologist. She knows more than she's told us." The unspoken thought that perhaps if a day passed or two, whatever lived in the tower slowly making words on the wall would have disappeared, or gotten so far ahead of us we would never catch up. But that brought to mind a disturbing image of the tower as endless, with infinite levels descending into the earth. The surveyor folded her arms. "You really don't get it, do you? This mission is over." Was she afraid? Did she just not like me enough to say yes? Whatever the reason, her opposition angered me, as did the smug look on her face. In the moment, I did something that I regret now. I said, "There's no reward in the risk of going back to the tower right now." I thought I had been subtle in my intonation of one of the psychologist's hypnotic cues, but a shudder passed over the surveyor's face, a kind of temporary disorientation. When it cleared, the look that remained told me she understood what I had tried to do. It wasn't even a look of surprise, more that in her mind I had confirmed an impression of me that she had been slowly forming, but was now set. Now, too, I had learned that hypnotic cues only worked for the psychologist. "You'd do anything, wouldn't you, to get your way," the surveyor said. But the fact was, she held the rifle. What weapon did I really have? And I told myself it was because I didn't want the anthropologist's death to be meaningless that I had suggested this course of action. When I did not reply, she sighed, then said with weariness in her voice, "You know, I finally figured it out while I was developing those useless photographs. What bothered me the most. It's not the thing in the tunnel or the way you conduct yourself or anything the psychologist did. It's this rifle I'm holding. This damn rifle. I stripped it down to clean it and found it was made of 30-year-old parts, cobbled together. Nothing we brought with us is from the present. Not our clothes, not our shoes. It's all old junk. Restored crap. We've been living in the past this whole time, in some sort of reenactment. And why?" She made a derisive sound. "You don't even know why." It was as much as she'd ever said to me at one time. I wanted to say that this information registered as little more than the mildest of surprises in the hierarchy of what we had thus far discovered, but it didn't. All I had left was to be succinct. "Will you remain here until I return?" I asked. This was now the essential question, and I didn't like the speed of her reply or its tone. "Whatever you want." "Don't say anything you can't back up," I said. I'd long ago stopped believing in promises. Biological imperatives, yes. Environmental factors, yes. Promises, no. "F off," she said. And so that's how we left it. Her leaning back in that rickety chair, holding her assault rifle, as I went off to discover the source of the light I had seen the night before. I had with me a knapsack full of food and water, along with 2 of the guns, equipment to take samples, and 1 of the microscopes. Somehow I felt safer taking a microscope with me. Some part of me, too, no matter how I had tried to convince the surveyor to come with me, welcomed the chance to explore alone, to not be dependent on or worried about anyone else. I looked back a couple times before the trail twisted away, and the surveyor was still sitting there, staring at me, like a distorted reflection of who I'd been just days before. Whew! That's chapter 2. Stuff has gone down. So, anthropologist is now dead. Surveyor has the psychologist has gone AWOL, and surveyor stays behind in camp while the biologist heads to the lighthouse. Now, there's lots of interesting stuff going on with the tower and, with the area, and I think I'll just wait to say my interpretation of the facts when the book is over, because more stuff needs to be revealed before I can talk about my theories. But it's all very cool. I forgot there were swear words in here. But yeah, that's this stream, and I hope you all come to see chapter 3.